Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Narkis Street Congregation's Bible study here in the book of Acts. And we are getting close to the end. Only a couple more chapters and we will be done. And tonight we'll be looking at Paul being shipwrecked as he's been on his journey to Rome. So let's open in prayer. Lord, thank you for allowing us to gather here tonight in the midst of everything, technology, and all the events that are going on in the world and our lives, and seeming chaos, things that don't always make sense. And we just ask that you would speak peace to us tonight, wherever we are, in whatever situation, and that you would teach us from your word and open our ears so that we can hear and that we can do your word. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. And so, a quick summary of what we looked at last Bible study in the first 26 verses of Acts 27. You'll remember that Paul was being escorted by a Roman centurion by the name of Julius. And the writer of Acts is talking how it's a group of them traveling with Paul. And he talks about we set sail for Rome from Caesarea. And so Caesarea is down there in the right corner in the green circle. And we're following the arrows up to the north and then over towards the west, then down to the south, and then eventually back up north in the far left corner. You see Rome circled in the green circle. So this is going to be the journey that Paul and his entourage are on. And their first stop will be in Lebanon, in the city of Sidon. And when they land there, the Roman centurion Julius allows Paul to go into the city and visit with friends. And so Julius, the Roman centurion, is being portrayed by the writer of Acts in a very positive light here. And he will continue to portray him in a positive light as well. And from Sidon, they then travel towards Asia Minor, today's Turkey, and they get off their boat in Myra, where they find an Alexandrian grain ship heading towards Rome. And so Myra is circled there in the green, the top left. And there they get on a much larger ship from what they were on when they first left Caesarea. It's called an Alexandrian ship, and these ships were known in Latin as corbita, and they were very, very large at that time in the Roman Empire. They could carry up to 1,300 tons of grain and liquids, and they were the backbone of Roman business, transporting supplies from around the empire into the capital city of Rome. And if you see that note at the very bottom, in fact, there was a Egyptian grain ship by the name of Isis that sailed about 100 years after Paul. And according to the ancient writers, it could hold a total of 600 passengers and crew. Paul's ship probably had around 300 passengers and crew. So it wasn't even like one of the largest back then. Here's the description of that massive boat called the Isis, which is not ISIS from the Islamic terrorist group, but the Egyptian goddess there on the right. That's a statue of her that was a Roman portrayal of Isis. And this boat was described by Lucian, the Roman writer, in the second century, so 100 years after Paul. But you can see how he describes how massive the ship was, 180 feet long, um, and very wide, 44 feet deep, and beautifully designed. And he says he was struck by how awesome the anchors were and all the different parts of the ship. And the crew was like a small army. And then he made this very wild statement that they say she can carry as much wheat as would feed every soul in Attica for a year, which is a province there in Greece. So this is a ship that he saw in the harbor of Athens, called the Isis, about 100 years after Paul. And so this is a ship that's similar to what Paul is now writing on, this Corbita. And this is kind of a scale drawing there. We'll find out later in Acts 27 that this Alexandrian ship is carrying wheat. And that was a very well-known commodity that would be shipped from Alexandria in Egypt to Rome in Italy. And that's because Alexandria was known for raising wheat there on the Nile River, there in Egypt, and they annually would produce 26 million metric tons of wheat. And so Rome, because it was the largest city in the world at that time and would be the largest city for the next 1800 years until you get to Victorian London, is the next time you find a city with 1 million inhabitants. Rome could not feed itself. It could not provide the bread that was needed for the population. And so Rome constantly had to have ships coming from Alexandria bringing wheat. And this is another drawing of one of these boats, the Corbita. And this was found in northern Africa, a couple hundred years after Paul and his journey. And so, going back to our summary from last Bible study, you'll remember that some winds were blowing against them as they were trying to leave Myra. And so they were sailing into winds, and it was forcing them south to the island of Crete. And they ended up going around Crete to the southern side, and they got off at Fair Havens there with the green line, Fair Havens. And but it turned out that Fair Havens wasn't so fair because it was not a good place for a winter encampment. And so the captain makes a decision, the owner and the captain make a decision to try to make it to almost the western side of the island of Crete, to Phoenix, to see if they could dock there for the winter. And you'll also remember that Acts 27 tells us that this is late in the sailing season. It's after the Day of Atonement. And so if this was in the year 59, we'd be somewhere in October. And in October, this is known as the closed season for sailing in the Mediterranean. You were not really supposed to sail. I mean, you could, but it was getting more and more dangerous because when winter officially arrived, they sailors would not go out November till almost March. So why is this ship owner doing this? Why is he endangering himself and his crew and all of the cargo? Because he wants to make money, because the emperor, because they needed grain throughout the year, was willing to pay higher prices for grain at this time. So if he were able to get the grain to Rome, even right before winter, he would get a higher profit for the risk that he was taking, because wheat bread was precious in Rome and keeping the people happy and not rebelling. But as they set out from Fair Havens, all of a sudden they get hit with this violent northeastern wind, Evrakulon, and it blows them away from Crete. It blows them away from the island. It says it blows them by that little island, Cauda. So you see the black arrow at the bottom. It's blowing them south away from Crete, and they are not able to come back to the island. And so they let their sails drop down and they are pushed along by the wind. And this is a violent northern wind that's pushing them out to sea. And so it's a storm, it's windy, and so it's now become super dangerous for everyone on this boat. So the sailors are trying to hold the ship together because the waves are crashing in. They send ropes underneath the boat to tie it to try to keep the cargo from dragging them down if a wave were to come upon them. They are lowering the sea anchors to try and not go too far south to hit the North African coast. That would destroy their boat and drown them all. They started throwing cargo and their tackle overboard, but eventually Paul tells them, everyone, don't worry. An angel of God has told me that I must arrive to Rome and every person on this boat will be saved. And that's where we ended in our last Bible study in Acts 27. Let's continue on as they are now 14 nights at sea in this storm. They're being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight on the 14th night, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and they found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and they let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So, last Bible study, I mentioned about how this whole sea voyage resembles Greco-Roman sea voyage narratives. And there are different writings, whether you look at the Odyssey or different Latin writers of that time, where they describe sea voyages. And our own Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived around the time of Paul and after, gave his own eyewitness account of when he was shipwrecked once on a voyage to Rome. So, in his Vita, in his autobiography, Josephus writes, when I was in the 26th year of my age, it happened that I took a voyage to Rome, and this on the occasion which I shall now describe. At the time when Felix was procurator of Judea, there were certain priests of my acquaintance, and very excellent persons they were, whom on a small and trifling occasion he had put into bonds, and sent to Rome to plead their cause before Caesar. These I was desirous to procure deliverance for, and that especially because I was informed that they were not unmindful of piety towards God, even under their afflictions, but supported themselves with figs and nuts. Accordingly, I came to Rome, though it were through a great number of hazards by sea. For as our ship was drowned in the Adriatic Sea, we that were in it, being about 600 in number, swam for our lives all the night. When upon the first appearance of the day, and upon our sight of a ship of Cyrene, I and some others, 80 in all, by God's providence, prevented the rest, and were taken up into the other ship. And when I had thus escaped, and was come to Dirchia, which the Italians called Puteoli. So you'll notice here in Josephus's own story, he also was going off to Rome, like Paul. And you'll notice Felix was the procurator of Judea at that time, which that was the first procurator when Paul was thrown into prison in Caesarea. Festus is the one who actually sent Paul off to Rome. But notice here, Felix, during his time, this is when Josephus went off to Rome, and he was going with some priests who were also being sent as prisoners to plead their cause before Caesar. So that's kind of an interesting parallel there. And and also notice the Adriatic Sea is both times mentioned in Paul's story and here. And you've got Josephus in the water all night, swimming for his life with 80 others. And but they were rescued by another ship coming from North Africa, from Cyrene. And notice they also end up there at the port city to Rome and Puteoli. And that's where Paul will be as well when we get to Acts 28. So not only does Paul's story here in Acts 27 sound authentic in the ancient narratives, it's also very technically credible and accurate for sailing at that time. For example, we've already been looking at these shipping patterns in the Mediterranean Sea. Ships would not sail a long distance route across water, but they would sail to hubs. And then at the hubs, they would get on bigger ships to go for these longer distances. Kind of like today with airports, there are planes from regional hubs that will fly in to these larger hubs, and then you will board a larger plane to fly to bigger cities. So, too, that's what the ships were doing 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean. And these ports that are mentioned in Acts 27 were well known port cities for these ships. And then these cargo routes that are carrying the grain from Egypt to Rome. As I mentioned, it was a very common and well known route. And it was these large Alexandrian cargo ships that were doing the great length of distance that, like Paul boarded in Myra. And these large ships could carry a lot of passengers and a lot of grain. And so they were a bit like an oil tanker in that they would move slow and steady, and they're very heavy going long distances. But when a storm would come about, they were not agile enough to get out of there to safety. And so it was not wise to take chances with these large boats. And as we also mentioned, it was well known about that you would not sail in the winter in the Mediterranean. And Acts 27 talks about that as well. And these winds that came up and suddenly pushed Paul's boat um, to the south and to the west, this violent storm wind, this Euraquilo, was a well-known wind in those ancient mariners' vocabulary. And then again, saving the ship when you were entering into a storm, where you would undergird the ship, try to hold it together, tie it up, um, lower your mast, get rid of your cargo, throw it overboard, sounding for depths, so that your ship would not crash into a low depth area of a sandbar or rocks or whatnot. And then throwing in your anchors at different points to try to slow down your ship or to keep it steady. And also in Acts 27, this 14 days of drift where they leave Crete and they end up in Malta, it all adds up. The distance and how far a storm-driven drift would push a boat. So all of this story makes great um, common sense in the ancient stories of sailing. And so this is where they end up 14 days later, um, seemingly halfway to Rome, approaching Malta on the 14th day. And it said there, we read that the sailors sensed that land was approaching, but you'll remember it was dark and they were in a storm. So how could they sense, or since they couldn't see it? And so if there were some birds that were landing on their mast or around their boat, and these would be birds not like the albatross, but ones that lived closer to land, maybe that would give them a clue that land was near. You can also smell land. It smells different than seawater. If they observed clouds that would normally form over land or islands, or if the way the water, the swells and the waves were coming were different in shape and direction because of having to come up to land, then maybe this is how the sailors would have sensed land was approaching. And so, because of that, they took soundings. And a sounding is where you would drop a line with a lead weight, usually about 5 kilograms, and you would drop it into the water, and the rope would have measurements on it, fathoms. And these fathoms um, would tell you how far down the land was. And the the lead weight would also be cone shaped on the bottom, and they would also be able to grab some of the soil or the dirt or what's on the bottom of the ocean at that point, and that would also give them clues about where they were or where they were approaching based off of what was coming up inside of that cone. And so in our story, the boat is approaching more shallow water when it goes from 20 fathoms to 15 fathoms. And so they sense that they're now going to possibly wreck their ship if they rub up onto land. So they throw out four anchors, and to slow them down, here's a reconstruction of a Roman ship anchor from the late imperial period. And here's also a reconstruction, this one by computer generation, of an anchor that was found actually near Malta. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And you'll remember as they are now slowing down, approaching the land. The sailors, or some of the sailors, are looking to get away after 14 days. I guess they've had enough and they're going to abandon ship and leave everybody. But Paul sees them and tells the soldiers, don't let them escape because we need them to guide this boat. And so then Paul says, look, we haven't been eating for 14 days. So that's kind of crazy. If you haven't really eaten for 14 days, they all must have looked very ragged, very hungry, very ravenous. And um, Paul is saying, we now need to eat some food. We need it to survive. And that word there in the Greek, soterias, the word for salvation, we need it for our salvation. And none of you will lose a single hair from your head, but you need to eat some food. And I mentioned last Bible study how salvation or rescue is a theme in these two last chapters of Acts. Salvation now from the shipwreck, and it's all about Paul's trip to Rome, salvation. And so there's 7 times in these two chapters that the Greek words related to salvation or rescue appear. So you'll remember when they were in the middle of the storm, they couldn't see the sun or the stars for many days, and they gave up all hope of being saved. Paul just said, "Don't let those sailors off the ship. If they do, we you cannot be saved." And then he just told them, "Eat some food because you need to survive. You need to be saved. Eat some food." And then the soldiers then want to kill all the prisoners because they're afraid as the ship is starting to break up, they don't want to be punished and be killed for allowing prisoners to escape. That was the punishment for a soldier. They were responsible for the prisoners. And the centurion wanted to save Paul's life, and so he didn't let the prisoners do that. And then eventually they all made it on shore safely, or they were saved. And so Paul is, as they're going to eat something, he takes some bread, he gives thanks to God, he breaks it, and he begins to eat. And it says they're all encouraged and they all begin to eat themselves. Now, you may recognize some of this language here about taking bread, giving thanks, breaking it, and eating it, because it's very biblical, very much from Jewish tradition, the blessing over bread, where you bless the Lord God, creator of the universe. And this goes all the way back into the biblical tradition in Deuteronomy 8, where Moses reminds the people about their time in the wilderness and how God led them for 40 years, how he humbled them and he caused them to hunger. And then he fed them with manna from heaven. And then he gives that very famous line, why did God give the people this bread from heaven? To teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And so the bread is just part of God's blessing to his people. And so now, as the people are going into Canaan, into this good land, this land that has all of this abundant blessing, wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing. And then verse 10, when you have eaten and are satisfied, bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. So you bless the Lord for the bread, for allowing you to eat. And so the biblical and the Jewish tradition that continues on from this is to give thanks to the Lord, to bless the Lord for the bread, for the food, not to bless the food. And a lot of Protestants, evangelicals are get confused and are traditions where we will pray and ask God to bless the food to our bodies, but this is not right. We're supposed to bless God for the bread, bless God for the food. You see it with Jesus when he's with his disciples. He's feeding the 5,000s, and they bring out these 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, and Jesus looks up to heaven. He gave thanks. Who's he giving thanks to? To the Father, and he broke them. And then they passed it out, and they all ate, and they were all satisfied. Then again, in the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8, Jesus takes the 7 loaves, he gives thanks, he breaks them, and he gives them, they distribute it to the people, they eat, and the people are satisfied. So you kind of notice this similarity here going back to Deuteronomy 8, verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, bless the Lord your God. So there's definitely um, a hint of going back in these stories of Jesus feeding the people and the Gospels, going back to Deuteronomy 8 of people eating, being satisfied, and you bless the Lord. And when you share your bread with others, we see this in the early church as well, it becomes a sign of peace, of covenant and relationship with God, the one that you're blessing, the one who's provided the bread, but also with each other, with the people that you are eating together, table fellowship, if you would. So you remember on the road to Emmaus, Jesus is walking along incognito with 2 other disciples, and they invite him in to stay the night. And he's at the table with them, and he took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. But again, you have the bread, you give thanks to the Lord, you break it, and you eat it. But what I find most interesting in our story in Acts 27 is Paul is blessing the Lord and passing the bread out, breaking it. The it's almost word for word from Jesus' Last Supper in Luke, whenever he was with his disciples and he talked about what the bread represented, because he took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it, and he gave it to them, and he said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And so it would be interesting to think if there was any connection in Acts 27:35, where Paul takes the bread, he gives thanks to God, he broke it, and they began to eat. So could this have been some sort of communion on the boat in the midst of their trial? But for sure, there's overtones here of that, I think, from the Last Supper. So they're all on board, 276 souls. And when they had eaten as much as they wanted, or shall we say they were satisfied, like in Deuteronomy 8, they got rid of all the grain. They dumped it into the sea so the boat would not be pulled down at this point as they're getting close to a low level of the sea level. And so you remember this, all this grain was going to bring enormous profit to the captain, but he's having to get rid of it because to save everyone's lives. And so the sun comes up and they don't know where they are, but they see a bay and they see a sandy beach. And then they decide, let's just run the ship into the ground. After all this time of trying not to do that, that's what they're going to do. They're probably going crazy at this point after being in the middle of a storm for 14 days. And from what I've read, the cargo would be down in the hold of the ship, and all passengers in those days, they would be riding on the deck the whole time. So they were under all the elements this whole time, probably losing their minds. Um, so this is where, according to tradition, that Paul's ship made its way into a sandy bay, and today it's called St. Paul's Bay, and on the island of Malta. And we'll look at Malta next Bible study in Acts 28, and this is where it would have made its way into, and they cut loose the anchors and they left them in the sea, and they untied the ropes that had held the rudders tight, and they hoisted the foresail and they tried to make for the beach, but the ship struck a sandbar, ran aground, and now the ship is being broken into pieces by the pounding of the waves, the surf. So here's what's interesting about this area in Malta. About 20 years ago, a rescue diver named Margat, who actually lives on Malta, was diving, and he found a Roman period anchor that had two inscriptions on it. And these were two inscriptions of two Egyptian gods, Isis, who we mentioned earlier, and Sarapi. And this was a massive anchor, weighed some 700 kilos. And even back in the 1970s, they had found an even larger ancient anchor that was weighing 4 tons. And both these anchors are in the museum there in Malta. And this is the museum in Malta in this picture there. I believe that's the massive anchor from the 1970s, the one that's standing up there. You see that person walking in the background. So it's a very, very large anchor. And then, but what I find interesting that maybe connects us to our story tonight, you'll remember that Paul is on an Alexandrian ship. And you'll remember there's that story about that ship called the Isis ship, the Egyptian goddess Isis. And in this bay of Malta, where it says in our story, they cut the anchors and they left them in the water, they found this anchor that the red arrows are pointing at. And then this is a close up at the bottom where it's got the names written there of Isis and Sarapi there in the Greek. And so you can see ISIS on that anchor underlined in red on the left, and then Sarapi underlined in red on the right side of that anchor. And so these are two Egyptian gods that would have fit very nicely on an Alexandrian grain ship. And so this is an overview of the bay, the anchor being found a little further out from there. But continuing on, we talked about the soldiers wanting to kill the prisoners, afraid that they would escape. And then the centurion says, no, don't do it. We have to spare Paul's life. And so everybody jumps overboard and they're floating on planks, trying to get to land safely. And this is how the story ends tonight, with the ship run aground on a sandbar, people either swimming, floating, trying to get to land. And you see Paul there in this fresco. I think he's got that gold halo crown around his head there on the right. And you see the snake coming out of the fire. This will be our story in the Bible study to come up for Acts 28 next time. But I just want to end with just a couple parallels from the Bible with Paul's storm, and to realize that this is a common theme actually in the Bible of shipwrecks, of being lost at sea, being afraid, because as we mentioned last Bible study, Yam in Hebrew for sea, the ocean, was this dark, mysterious, scary, dangerous phenomena, and you didn't know what was out there in the deep, and it was a place to be afraid. And And so you've got these stories where the people they're stopped at the sea. They're trying to get away from Pharaoh and his army, and God parts the sea. He has control of this dark, scary thing, and he saves Israel by controlling and parting the sea. And so the people walk on dry ground. And in Psalm 93, the same thing. The Lord controls the seas, that even though the seas have this very loud voice, especially in storms, pounding waves, the Lord is the one who is in control of the seas. And Isaiah 43, that famous prophecy to Jacob, to Israel, do not fear. I've called you by name. You are mine. And when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. So again, the Lord um, calms and he encourages his people to trust him when these storms of life and these seas seem so dangerous and dark. Psalm 107, it's specifically talking about sailors who are at sea, how they go out in ships to sea. These are merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the work of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. So the sailors just need to cry out, ask the Lord for help, and he will answer them in Psalm 107. And we see this play out in the life of Jesus in the story of the Sea of Galilee, when on the lake where a storm or a tempest comes up, when Jesus is in the boat with his 12 disciples and Jesus is asleep. His disciples wake him up. Master, we're going to drown. And Jesus rebukes the wind and the waters, and the storm stops, and all is calm. And his disciples say, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. And so there's a strong allusion here going back to the Psalms, to Isaiah, even to the Red Sea, where God is the one who commands the waters to part. God is the one that is in control of the storm. And Jesus demonstrates this to his disciples. And then finally, the most famous storm, I think, in the Bible is the prophet Jonah. The book of Jonah talks about how God calls Jonah, the prophet, to go to Nineveh, the great city of the enemy of the Israelites at that time. And Nineveh is to the east, but Jonah runs the opposite direction. He gets on a boat in Jaffa and he goes west towards Tarshish. And so while Jonah is on that boat, he goes to sleep down below, and a great wind comes upon the sea, a violent storm, and it threatens to break the ship up. And the sailors are afraid. And so it really reminds you of our story tonight with Paul being at sea for 14 days and trying to keep their wits end. And so the sailors are afraid. They're crying to their own gods, and they start throwing the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. And finally, the captain wakes Jonah up and says, why are you sleeping? Wake up, call out to your God. Maybe he will listen to you. We're trying to figure out why, how we can silence or distill this storm that we're in the middle of. And they cast lots, and the lot falls on Jonah. He's responsible um, for this storm. Who are you? And so he says, I am this Hebrew of the Lord. And he tells them that he's running away from the Lord, and they are terrified by this. What do you think you're doing? And so the seas are getting worse and worse, and they want to know, what can we do to make the sea calm down? And he says, pick me up, throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. But the men don't want to do this because they don't want to kill somebody in order to save their lives. And so finally, they say, okay, we'll do it because nothing else is working. We're not able to get to the land. But don't hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, O Lord. And so they take Jonah and they throw him overboard, and the sea calms down. And the men are shocked, and they offer sacrifices to the Lord, and they make vows to him. So tonight with Paul's storm, and I see parallels here with Jonah's storm, that Jonah was this prophet, and he's called by God to go to Nineveh, which at that time was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, which means it was the capital of the Gentile world, the non-Jewish or non-Israelite world. But he decides to travel away from Nineveh, the capital. Paul, on the other hand, is traveling towards Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, the capital of the Gentile world at that time. So Paul is being obedient to go there. God tells him, you're going to go to Rome, and so Paul obeys and goes. Jonah, on the other hand, disobeys. He um, doesn't want to do it. And so the storm is this type of judgment in the case of Jonah, whereas in Paul, the storm is a trial. It is something that must happen along the way in your walk of obedience. And in both cases, Jonah and Paul acknowledge that God is in control. He's the one who's orchestrating the storm and the events that are leading them to where they have to go. In Jonah's case, because he's disobeyed and he's on this boat, and the judgment of God is coming, chasing him, the presence of Jonah is endangering the sailors on the boat. But in Paul's case, in Acts 27, Paul's presence is going to preserve everyone on the boat because God tells him, Paul must get to Rome, and so your lives will be preserved or saved because of Paul's presence. But it's the opposite with Jonah. He is endangering the sailors while he's on that boat. It's only when he's thrown off the boat that they are saved. You'll notice that Jonah is not acting very responsible. Um, he's very passive, and so he doesn't deal with the problem immediately. And it's only, for instance, why didn't he just throw himself into the water? Why did he tell the sailors, "You've got to throw me in the water"? Whereas Paul is leading by example. He's demonstrating his faith and his obedience and trust in the Lord. Whereas Jonah is essentially like a floppy fish that gets thrown back into the water. Um, and in both cases, their words, their lives, they are witnesses of, of the Lord God to the Gentile sailors. So in Jonah's case, the ones that are going to the Assyrian Empire, and in Paul's case, the sailors that are going to Rome. And so in conclusion, I think we see tonight in Paul's journey to Rome, the hazards that he encounters, the shipwreck, the dangers. This is a picture of obedience, of faithfulness, despite and through the trials that come along the way. So instead of quitting and running away, Paul continues on in faith, believing that God has called him to be a witness in Rome. He's already said this a couple times before chapter 27. God was putting it on his heart that he was one day going to Rome, and he is going to preach repentance to the Gentiles, the Romans, but also he will be preaching to the Jews that are living in Rome as well. So Jonah, remember, he was told to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Gentile world, and preach repentance. Remember, his message was in 40 days, Nineveh will be overturned. And then they responded. The Assyrians responded to his message and they repented. Likewise, Paul is now going to Rome, this capital of the Gentile world then, and this time he's preaching repentance through Jesus. And I see a nice parallel here with Jesus, where he talks about he will only give the sign of Jonah to the generation. And in Luke, the sign of Jonah is this repentance that Jonah preached in Nineveh. But you could also expand it, maybe midrashically, as one man's life saving many. So Jonah was on the boat. All of the people on the boat's lives were endangered. And he said, okay, throw me over. I give my life up. I'm the one responsible. Throw me over. And so everyone is saved by him giving his life up. Obviously, Jesus parallels this with the whole idea of redemption, of him dying for the sins at the crucifixion. And then Paul tonight, his life, he doesn't actually die in his story, but he steps into the gap and he stays alive. And by his presence, he's able to save all 276 of those passengers. And so I think that ties up nicely with this theme of salvation that we've seen here. And the writer of the Gospel of Luke is the same writer of this book of Acts. And if you remember how the Gospel of Luke ends, it ends with Jesus' trial, his crucifixion, his death, but then his resurrection and the salvation that comes through his resurrection. So too, we are going to see as the book of Acts comes to an end, it's ending in Rome, and it ends with Paul's journey to Rome and his trial, this storm, the shipwreck. But ultimately, it's going to end with him arriving safely in Rome in salvation.